It's already week 7 of the fantasy football season, and we're still on a quest to find the tightest of all ends. Or is it the ends that are the tightest? I don't remember. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there. Today we're talking about our top 15 tight ends for week 7 fantasy football. Now before we dive into the rankings, let's take a look at some of my bigger hits and misses from just last week. And I'll be honest, the only reason I'm even doing this at the tight end position is just to continue the accountability, because there's nothing safe or consistent about the tight end position through 6 weeks of the season. However, some of my bigger hits, we got George Kittle, he had himself a huge week. Trey McBride, Sam Laporta, all finished highly, all were ranked highly. Some of my bigger misses, how about Mark Andrews? He's doing just enough to piss everyone off in fantasy football. Evan Ingram, he came back to a huge target share. Did not see that in his first game back. He was a miss. And then Cole Kmet. I honestly expected DJ Moore to do more in that matchup, and honestly, it was Cole Kmet and Keenan Allen the entire game. So yeah, I did not have him ranked high enough, but now it's the time to move in to week 7. Let's bring up our tier 1 tight ends. And right here in tier 1, I got George Kittle, Brock Bowers, Travis Kelce, and Trey McBride. Now for George Kittle, he's got a matchup going up against Kansas City. He's the overall tight end 1 right now, averaging 14.5 fantasy points per game, and has had at least 12.5 fantasy points in each of his last 4 games played. He also has touchdowns in 4 straight games, and no team allows more fantasy points per game to the opposing tight ends than the Kansas City Chiefs. George Kittle going to be my tight end 1 this week. Then we go down to Brock Bowers in a matchup going up against the Rams. He's the current tight end 2 on the season. We know Devontae Adams is now gone. Jacoby Myers is questionable, even though I do think that he plays. But he has back-to-back games now with 10-plus targets, does Brock Bowers. Also back-to-back games with at least 8 receptions. And now a matchup going up against the Rams. They allow the second most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Are we going to have a good tight end week here in week 7? After Brock Bowers, though, we go down to Travis Kelce, going up against the San Francisco 49ers. And because of all the injuries there in Kansas City, it's leading to the Chiefs having to go back to Travis Kelce more than they had originally planned to. He's had back-to-back games now with at least 9 targets and 7 receptions. However, still no touchdowns, but you have to think they're coming. In a matchup this week going up against the 49ers, they allow 7 fantasy points per game, but honestly, I think Kelce can outperform that number given the volume he'll see this week. Then we have Trey McBride going up against the Chargers. He's the current tight end 6, and we know Marvin Harrison Jr. is currently in the concussion protocol. Now, Trey McBride has back-to-back games with at least 8 targets and at least 6 receptions. Now, really, if there's any other silver lining here, it's that the LA Chargers are typically better against wide receivers than they are tight ends, so Trey McBride's going to find himself right here at the bottom of tier 1, really just due to the volume alone. Now, after Trey McBride, let's transition down to tier number 2, where we have Evan Ingram, Sam Laporta, Kyle Pitts, David Njoku, Tucker Kraft, and Dalton Kincaid. Now for Evan Ingram, what a comeback this dude had last week in London. He did so well, he gets to stay in London again. He had 10 targets for 10 receptions and 102 yards just last week. This Jacksonville defense is so bad, they're allowing points to everyone, which means the Jacksonville Jaguars have to throw the ball consistently. That's only going to give Evan Ingram a safe floor weekly. Hopefully. Then we got Sam Laporta going up against the Minnesota Vikings. The target share here has been an absolute mystery. Last week, only 1 target, 1 catch, but it was for 52 yards and a touchdown. Now they have a matchup going up against Minnesota, who allows the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and the Vikings are a lot easier to throw on than run on. After Laporta, we got Kyle Pitts going up against the Seattle Seahawks. Now Pitts, he's the current tight end 8. He has back-to-back games with at least 8 fantasy points, but no touchdowns since week 1. Now a matchup this week going up against Seattle, they allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, so Kyle Pitts is sitting right here at number 7. Then we go down to David Njoku of the Cleveland Browns, going up against the Cincinnati Bengals. We know Amari Cooper is now gone. What that also means is David Njoku should be in line for a lot more targets, and at this position, targets are absolutely gold. My biggest concerns are whether or not Deshaun Watson can give him catchable targets at this point, but in a matchup going up against Cincinnati, they allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, so David Njoku right here at number 8. Then we go down to Tucker Kraft, going up against the Houston Texans, and his hot streak came to an end in week 6, but now we know that Dontavian Wicks and Jaden Reed both got banged up. Now, while I think Jaden Reed is going to be just fine, Dontavian Wicks could be a little bit limited. But typically, the Houston Texans are pretty good against tight ends. They actually allow the third fewest fantasy points per game to the tight end position, so that's why Tucker Kraft has been dropped down a few spots. Then we have Dalton Kincaid here to round out tier 2, going up against Tennessee. Do we have Amari Cooper in this Buffalo Bill offense this week? If we do, Dalton Kincaid for sure takes a hit when it comes to target share. He's already not producing big numbers. He's only had one game all year with at least 50 yards receiving and only has one touchdown on the season. Now they get a matchup going up against Tennessee, and no team in the NFL allows fewer points to opposing tight ends than the Tennessee Titans. So we'll move on from tier 2 then. Now we're going to go down to tier 3 where we have Zach Ertz, Mark Andrews, Cade Otton, Jonnu Smith, and Hunter Henry. For Zach Ertz, he's got a matchup going up against Carolina, and he's coming off his best game of the season, and now he gets a great matchup against Carolina, who allows the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. After him, we got Mark Andrews going up against Tampa Bay, and I don't think anyone on earth right now actually trusts Mark Andrews weekly when it comes to fantasy football. It's like he sucks you in and then just gives you the fantasy finger. But now he's got a matchup going up against Tampa Bay, who allows 8 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. If Mark Andrews scores 8 fantasy points this week, I'm actually going to be ecstatic. After him, we got Cade Otton going up against Baltimore. Now, it's not amazing, but at least he's had 8 fantasy points now in 2 of his last 3 games. We know that Mike Evans could be dealing with an injury that could limit him, and Baltimore allows the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Could we see some additional targets this week going the way of Cade Otton? Then we got Jonnu Smith in Miami in a matchup going up against Indianapolis, and we talked a few weeks ago about Tyler Huntley and how he absolutely loves his tight ends. Well, in the game prior to the bye, we saw Jonnu Smith go out and get a season-high 8 targets. Those 8 targets resulted in 61 yards, which is also a season high. Now a matchup going up against Indianapolis, they allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and then we'll round out tier 3 with Hunter Henry in that London matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, and this one really is all about the matchup. The Jags defense can't stop anyone, anywhere, at any level of the field. They allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Really the biggest question mark here, is it Drake May under center? He looked pretty good last week in his first start, but did just have an MRI Wednesday evening. We're awaiting the results of those tests. It's just something to pay attention to whether we have Drake May or Jacoby Brissett, which is going to go ahead and round out our top 15 tight ends here for week 7. Now, we're still getting quite a few comments from people wanting some flex rankings, defense rankings, kicker rankings. We do those as well, and if you want access to those, they are actually a member perk, and you'll need to hit the join button just below the video. But you're going to get more than just access to those rankings. You're going to get a members-only live stream on Sunday. You're going to get access to Discord, plus additional members-only videos. So if that's something you're interested in, be sure to become a channel member today. But that's going to go ahead and do it for today's tight end rankings. I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics, all the chain, all the channels, not the same.